A single wedding ring hanging from a leather cord made the lonely rancher realize the woman stepping off the stagecoach was hiding a story no marriage contract could explain. The wagon screeches to a stop as cold Wyoming wind whips dust across the station. Luke's fingers tighten around the marriage letter, while a woman in a faded black dress steps down, clutching a scarred wooden trunk. The only sound is the slow creak of leather. Then every eye turns toward the ring around her neck. She wasn't the bride he expected, but why had she come instead? Stay with us and discover the truth behind this unforgettable Western love story. Autumn settled across the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains in long ribbons of gold and copper. Cottonwood leaves drifted across the wagon road leading into Red Bluff, collecting against hitching posts and wagon wheels. The morning carried the smell of cold earth, horses, and wood smoke rising from chimneys before sunrise. Luke Dawson folded the letter one last time before slipping it into the pocket of his weathered coat. Your bride is expected on the westbound coach arriving Tuesday. He had read those words so often that the paper had softened along its creases. For nearly 15 years, Black Mesa Ranch had belonged to him alone. He had buried his father on the hill overlooking the south pasture. His mother had passed long before that. Seasons came and went with little more than cattle drives, broken fences, lonely suppers, and long winters spent listening to wind push against the cabin walls. He had not ordered love, only company. Someone willing to build a home beside him. The stagecoach rolled into Red Bluff just before noon, its wheels throwing dust over the narrow street lined with false front stores, a blacksmith shop, and the general store where Walter Briggs stood talking with two ranch hands. Horace Bell waited beside the coach, smiling far too easily. When the driver climbed down and opened the passenger door, Luke straightened his hat. A young woman did step down, but she was not the girl described in the letter. She wore a plain black morning dress, faded from years beneath the sun. A small wooden trunk rested at her feet. Around her neck hung a leather cord carrying a simple wedding ring that caught the afternoon light for only a moment before disappearing beneath her collar. She stood quietly, looking neither frightened nor proud. Only tired. Horace cleared his throat. Luke, this is Ruby Ellis. Luke didn't move. I believe you've mistaken someone. Horace looked away before answering. The original bride left weeks ago. Couldn't be found. This was the only arrangement available. Silence settled over the street. Walter Briggs removed his pipe from his mouth. So that's the rancher's bride? A few men laughed softly. Horace continued before Luke could answer. I couldn't return your payment. Miss Ellis needed a respectable place. You needed a wife. Seems practical enough. Ruby finally spoke. If you'd rather send me away, Mr. Dawson, I understand. Her voice was calm, almost worn smooth by years of disappointment. I won't cause trouble. Luke looked at her worn boots. One sole had been stitched twice by hand. Dust covered the hem of her dress. The trunk beside her had been repaired with thin strips of iron nailed across a cracked corner. Everything she owned fit inside it. He glanced down the street. There wasn't another coach leaving until Friday. No boarding house in Red Bluff would take in a lone widow with little money once night fell. Luke let out a slow breath. Load the trunk. Horace blinked. You'll take her? Luke picked up the trunk himself. I said load it. The whispers followed them before the wagon even reached the edge of town. By the time Black Mesa Ranch came into view beneath the shadow of the hills, the story had already begun traveling faster than horses. The widow bride. Isaac Doyle met them near the front gate, wiping grease from his hands after repairing a wagon axle. His eyes moved from Luke to Ruby, then to the black dress. He asked nothing, only opened the gate. The ranch house stood against the western slope, built from rough pine logs weathered gray by years of snow and wind. Beyond it stretched the horse barn, corrals, hay sheds, and the kitchen garden already dying back for winter. Several cowboys stopped pitching hay. One nudged another with his elbow. "So that's her? Doesn't look much like the letter Luke showed us." Another chuckled. "The widow bride." No one used her name. Ruby heard every word. She neither hurried nor slowed. She lifted the trunk again before Luke quietly took it from her without speaking. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of coffee, saddle leather, and cedar smoke. Dust rested on the shelves of the kitchen. A kettle sat upside down beside the cold stove. Ruby glanced around without comment. Luke set the trunk near the back door. "The main room has only one bed." She nodded before he finished. "I understand. There's an old bunk room behind the tack shed. That will be fine. It isn't much. I've had less." For a moment, neither of them knew what else to say. Luke fetched 2 wool blankets from the linen chest. One had been patched by his mother years before. He hesitated before handing it over. Ruby accepted it with both hands. "Thank you." No smile, no embarrassment. Just quiet gratitude. As darkness settled across the ranch, supper was simple. Bread, beans, black coffee. They ate at opposite ends of the table while only the ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Outside, coyotes called somewhere beyond the north pasture. When the meal ended, Ruby washed the dishes before Luke could object. Then she carried the blankets toward the small bunk room behind the tack shed. Luke watched the lantern light disappear into the darkness. He remained on the porch long after the ranch had fallen silent. Near midnight, he stepped outside again after hearing the loose gate creak in the wind. A faint light glowed from the little bunkhouse. He meant only to make sure the lantern hadn't tipped over. But through the half-open window, he stopped. Ruby sat alone on the edge of the narrow bed. She slowly lifted the leather cord over her head. The wedding ring rested in her palm. Her fingers closed around it so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. For several moments, she simply stared at it. Then her shoulders trembled. No sound escaped. Only one quiet tear slipped onto the worn wooden floor. Luke stepped back into the darkness before she could notice him. The wind carried dry leaves across the yard. He looked once more toward the small window. Who was Ruby Ellis before she arrived in Red Bluff? And why did it seem as though that little ring carried far more than the memory of a dead husband? Luke carried those questions with him the next morning, as surely as he carried a saddle over his shoulder. The first frost had settled across Black Mesa Ranch. Thin sheets of ice covered the water trough beside the horse barn. Smoke drifted from the chimney before sunrise. Ruby was already awake. She had found an old apron hanging behind the pantry door and tied it neatly around her waist. A pot of coffee simmered over the stove. Fresh biscuits rested beneath a clean towel she must have found folded inside an empty flour barrel. No one had asked her to cook. No one had shown her where anything belonged. Yet the kitchen somehow looked different. The cracked window had been washed. The cast-iron pans were hanging in order instead of piled on the table. Even the worn pine floor had been swept clean. Luke stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to do all this." Ruby poured coffee into a chipped blue mug. "I couldn't sleep." She slid the mug toward him. The stove was cold. That was all she said. Outside, the ranch slowly came alive. Horses stamped inside the stable. Harness chains rattled. A rooster crowed somewhere behind the bunkhouse. Isaac Doyle walked in, removed his gloves, and sat at the table without a word. Ruby placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of him. The old cowboy looked down at it. "You remembered I take molasses?" Ruby gave a small nod. There was only one jar. Isaac took a slow bite, then another. He quietly reached for a second biscuit before looking toward Luke. You'd better keep this one around. Luke almost smiled. By afternoon, Ruby had mended 2 torn saddle blankets using heavy linen thread she found inside an old sewing basket. She polished rust from a kettle, stacked firewood beside the back door, and spent nearly an hour rubbing down an aging bay mare everyone had assumed would never work again. The mare lowered its head into Ruby's shoulder, as though they had known each other for years. Isaac watched from the corral fence. Funny thing about horses, he murmured. They know gentle hands quicker than people do. Life at the ranch settled into a quiet rhythm. Luke repaired fences. Isaac checked cattle along the south pasture. Ruby kept the house warm. No one spoke much. Still, each evening there was hot coffee waiting when the men came in from the wind. 3 days later, Luke rode into Red Bluff for lamp oil and horseshoe nails. Walter Briggs stood outside the general store weighing flour on a brass scale. He smiled before Luke even climbed down. So, how's married life? Luke ignored the remark. Walter leaned closer. I've heard things. Luke continued loading sacks into the wagon. They say your widow spent years working around a stage station over in Kansas. Still no answer. Walter lowered his voice. Lots of travelers, lots of men coming and going. Luke finally looked at him. You hear that from someone who knows her? Walter shrugged. Stories travel. They usually grow on the road. Luke climbed back onto the wagon and drove away. But stories traveled faster than wagons. By Saturday, nearly everyone in Red Bluff had heard one version or another. When Sunday arrived, Luke brushed the dust from his black coat and hitched the wagon. Ruby appeared wearing the same dark dress she had arrived in, though she had carefully stitched the frayed cuff with black thread so neatly it was almost impossible to notice. You don't have to come, Luke said. She fastened her bonnet beneath her chin. I know. After a pause, she added quietly, but I'd like to. The wooden church stood near the center of town beside a grove of cottonwoods already dropping their last leaves. Families filled the front steps. Conversations drifted through the cool morning air. They stopped when Luke and Ruby climbed down from the wagon. Eyes followed them, some curious, some uncertain. Walter Briggs tipped his hat with a smile that carried little kindness. So tell me, he called loudly enough for others to hear, can a widow still arrive as a bride? A hush settled across the churchyard. Ruby lowered her eyes, not in shame, only in weariness. She turned slightly toward the wagon. Before she could take another step, Luke removed his hat. He walked to her side. Then he faced the small gathering. If anyone has something to say to Miss Ellis, he let the silence finish the sentence. Say it to me first. No one answered. Even Walter looked away. The church bell rang. One by one, people filed quietly through the doors. Inside, Ruby sat in the last pew, Luke beside her. Neither spoke during the service, but when the final hymn ended and they walked back toward the wagon, there was less distance between them than before. The ride home was almost silent. Only the steady creak of leather harnesses and the sound of wagon wheels rolling across the frozen road filled the afternoon. Near sunset, Ruby stood on the porch watching the sky turn pale orange above the Bighorn Mountains. Luke carried another armload of firewood toward the house. She spoke without looking at him. My husband. She paused. He didn't die from sickness. Luke waited. He was shot. The words drifted into the evening air almost like smoke. She looked down at the wedding ring resting once again beneath her collar. I've never told anyone here that before. Luke said nothing. He simply placed the firewood beside the porch door. After a long moment, he nodded once, not asking another question, not pressing for more, only letting her know she had been heard. The first stars appeared above Black Mesa Ranch. For the first time since Ruby had arrived, neither of them felt entirely like strangers. By morning, a cold wind had swept across the Powder River country. Thin clouds drifted low over the Bighorn Mountains, promising an early snow. Ruby stood on the back porch, shaking flour from an apron before hanging it beside the kitchen door. Luke was repairing a broken fence rail near the north pasture when Isaac Doyle rode over from the cattle pens. "Rider coming." Luke looked toward the road. A lone horse moved steadily through the yellow grass. The rider wore a dark duster and carried a leather document case strapped behind his saddle. He did not slow until he reached the ranch gate. "My name is Edgar Holloway." His eyes settled on Ruby before they found Luke again. "I'm looking for my brother's widow." Ruby's hands became perfectly still. Luke noticed before anyone else. Edgar removed a folded packet from the leather case. "I've come to settle unfinished business." By noon, they sat around Luke's kitchen table. The papers were spread across the worn pine boards. A county attorney from Sheridan had accompanied Edgar as far as Red Bluff and had signed the documents before returning east. Luke studied the seal pressed into the paper. It was official. Edgar rested one hand on the deed. "This land belonged to my brother, Samuel Holloway." Ruby finally spoke. "It belonged to both of us." Edgar ignored her. "The day my brother died, she disappeared." His finger tapped the document. "And she took the original deed." Ruby's voice remained steady. "I took what my husband left in my care. You stole it. I protected it." The room fell quiet. Outside, a loose shutter knocked softly against the wall. Luke looked from Edgar to Ruby. "You never mentioned land." Ruby lowered her eyes. "I never thought it mattered." Edgar gave a dry laugh. "It matters enough that she crossed 2 territories carrying it." He gathered the papers and stood. "You've got 3 days, Ruby. Return what's mine. If you don't—" He looked toward Luke. "The sheriff will hear the rest." When Edgar rode away, dust followed him down the road until both horse and rider disappeared behind a stand of cottonwoods. Luke remained on the porch for a long time. Ruby quietly collected the coffee cups from the table. She rinsed each one before placing them upside down on a towel. Neither spoke. Late that evening, Luke found her folding clean blankets inside the bunk room. He leaned against the doorframe. "Ruby." She turned. He searched for the right words, but found only one question. "Is there anything else you haven't told me?" She looked at him for a long moment. The lantern beside the bed flickered softly. "I've been trying to leave my past behind." "That wasn't my question." She closed the wooden trunk. "No." Luke nodded once, but something in his face changed. Not anger, not disappointment, only uncertainty. Ruby saw it. Neither tried to explain. The silence between them lingered long after the lantern burned low. Before dawn the next morning, frost covered the porch rails. Isaac was the first to notice the empty bunk room. Luke stepped inside. The blanket had been folded, the lantern chimney cleaned. Nothing was out of place. Ruby's trunk was gone. On the small bedside table lay 3 things: a neatly folded handkerchief, her worn Bible, and a sealed envelope with Luke's name written carefully across the front. His hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was only a single page. "Mr. Dawson, you offered kindness when you owed me nothing. I cannot ask you to carry the weight of a life I never had the courage to explain. The deed was my husband's final trust. I have to finish what he asked of me. Please remember me kindly. Ruby." Luke read the letter twice, then a third time. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Isaac appeared at the doorway holding something he had found near the hitching rail, a fresh horseshoe print. She headed east before daylight. Luke saddled his bay gelding without another word. As he tightened the cinch strap, something white caught beneath the edge of the porch. He bent down and picked it up. It was another paper that must have slipped from Ruby's trunk. Not a deed. Not a letter. A death certificate. Samuel Holloway. Cause of death. Gunshot wound. Signed by the county doctor. Attached behind it was a faded witness statement. One sentence drew Luke's eyes immediately. The only witness was the widow, Ruby Ellis. She identified Edgar Holloway near the scene shortly before the shooting. Luke's grip tightened around the papers. Edgar hadn't come to recover family land. He had come to silence the only person who knew what had truly happened. Luke swung into the saddle. Without looking back at the ranch, he turned his horse toward the eastern road leading out of Red Bluff. Snowflakes began drifting across the prairie. For the first time since Ruby arrived, he understood she hadn't been running from her past. She had been trying to outride a man who was still chasing it. Luke urged his bay gelding north along the narrow trail that wound beside Powder River. The morning sky had turned the color of worn steel. Snow clouds gathered over the Bighorn Mountains, swallowing the peaks one by one. He reached the sheriff's office just after sunrise. Sheriff Owen Burke looked up from a ledger spread across his desk. "You look like a man who's seen the truth too late." Luke laid the folded letter on the desk. Owen read it once, then again. So Edgar never wanted justice. He wanted the land, Luke replied, and anyone who stood in his way. The sheriff reached for his coat without another word. If Ruby is headed toward the county line, there's only one path she'll take this time of year. Devil's Crossing. By mid-afternoon, the first snow began to fall. Ruby pulled her coat tighter as she guided the borrowed wagon through the rocky pass. The wind pushed against the canvas cover, making it snap like a loose sail. She knew Edgar would come. She had only hoped to reach the stage station beyond the ridge before he did. A rider appeared through the blowing snow, then another. Edgar reined his horse across the narrow trail. "There you are." Ruby stopped the wagon. The mule pawed nervously at the frozen ground. Edgar climbed down slowly. "You've made this much harder than it needed to be. I owe you nothing. You owe me that deed. It never belonged to you." His smile faded. "It will." He motioned toward the wagon. "Sign the transfer, and you walk away." Ruby shook her head. The wind carried snow between them. "I watched Thomas die because he refused to hand you that land. I'm not making the same mistake." Edgar's face hardened. "You think anyone will believe a widow over me?" Before Ruby could answer, another voice echoed through the pass. "They'll believe the law." Sheriff Owen Burke rode into view. Luke followed close behind. For a heartbeat, Ruby simply stared. She hadn't expected him to come. Luke dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. Their eyes met across the drifting snow. "I'm sorry," he said. Only 3 words. But they carried everything he hadn't found the courage to say before. Edgar reached for the wagon reins. Ruby reacted first. The small kitchen knife she always carried rested inside the pocket of her apron beneath her coat. She cut the lead strap, securing the team. The frightened mules lunged forward. The wagon jerked sideways. Edgar stumbled as the wheels struck a rock hidden beneath the snow. One wheel climbed the edge of the trail. The wagon tipped. Wood cracked. Crates spilled into the ravine below. Edgar lost his footing and slid several yards before crashing into a drift against a fallen pine. Sheriff Burke and his deputy quickly closed the distance. "Don't move," Owen ordered. Edgar looked toward the trees, measuring his chances. Then he saw Luke standing between him and the only open trail. His shoulders sagged. The sheriff fastened iron cuffs around Edgar's wrists. "It's over." Just then a sharp crack echoed through the pass. A slab of snow and loose stone broke free from the hillside above. "Ruby!" Luke shouted. She looked up too late. Luke threw himself toward her. The falling rocks struck the ground, where she had been standing only a heartbeat before. One heavy stone caught Luke across the shoulder, knocking him hard into the snow. The mountains fell silent again. Ruby dropped beside him. "Luke." He opened his eyes with difficulty. "I'm all right. You are a terrible liar." Despite everything, the corner of his mouth lifted. Sheriff Burke helped Edgar onto a horse for the ride back to Red Bluff. "You two won't make town before dark," he called. "There's an old trapper's cabin less than a mile east." Snow thickened until the trail nearly disappeared. The cabin was little more than 4 log walls and a stone chimney. Ruby coaxed a fire from dry cedar kindling left beside the hearth. Luke sat on a rough wooden chair while she loosened the bandage around his shoulder. "You should have let me move. You didn't have time." She poured warm water from a black kettle into a tin basin and carefully cleaned the scrape beneath his torn shirt. Neither spoke for several minutes. Only the crackle of the fire filled the room. When she finished, Luke reached into his coat. He laid 2 things on the table: a railroad ticket to Denver and the iron key to the front door of Black Mesa Ranch. Ruby looked from one to the other. "If you want a fresh start somewhere else," Luke said quietly, "I'll drive you to the station myself." He slid the key closer. "If you want to come home." He paused. "The house is yours too." Ruby slowly lifted the leather cord from around her neck. She held the wedding ring in her palm for a long moment. Then she placed it gently beside the cabin lamp. Not forgotten, not hidden, simply laid to rest. She picked up the key. Her fingers closed around it. But she didn't answer. Outside, the storm eased. Inside, something quieter had begun. The next morning, as pale sunlight slipped through the frosted window, the sound of hoofbeats drifted toward the cabin. Luke stepped outside. A young woman in a blue traveling cloak climbed down from a stage driver's wagon. She looked tired and nervous. "My name is Emily Foster," she said. "I believe I'm the bride who was supposed to come to Black Mesa Ranch." The wind had almost died. Snow clung to the pine branches around the trapper's cabin, and the morning carried the clean scent that always followed a hard storm. Luke looked from Emily to Ruby. Neither woman spoke. Emily removed her gloves slowly. "I owe both of you an explanation." She glanced down at the frozen ground before meeting Luke's eyes again. "My father arranged the marriage without asking me. I ran before the coach ever reached Cheyenne. I thought if I disappeared long enough, he'd give up." She let out a small breath. "I never knew someone else would be sent in my place." Ruby tightened her hand around the iron key Luke had given her. Emily looked toward her. "I didn't lose my place because of you. You never took it." "I left it." For the first time since the morning began, Ruby's shoulders eased. Sheriff Owen Burke stepped out of the cabin carrying a folded warrant. "We've got another matter to settle." 2 days later, Red Bluff gathered outside the courthouse. Edgar Holloway sat in a holding cell. Horace Bell stood beside the sheriff, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Emily told the whole story. She described how Horace accepted Luke's payment, concealed her disappearance, and placed Ruby on the coach simply to avoid returning the money. Ruby answered every question without raising her voice. She spoke of Thomas Holloway, of the homestead claim, and of the night Edgar demanded the deed before his own brother was killed. The courtroom fell quiet. Sheriff Burke placed both hands on Horace's shoulders. "Horace Bell, you're under arrest for fraud and for knowingly falsifying legal marriage arrangements." Horace lowered his head, No one defended him. When the hearing ended, people drifted into the cold street in silence. Walter Briggs remained near the hitching rail. Ruby walked past him carrying her small wooden trunk. He removed his hat. "I judged you before I knew you." She stopped. Walter looked at the dirt beneath his boots. "I was wrong." Ruby studied him for a moment. Then she gave a single nod. Neither of them spoke again. Spring arrived slowly across the Powder River country. Snow melted into clear streams that crossed the pasture below Black Mesa Ranch. One afternoon, Ruby stood on the piece of land that had finally been returned to her by court order. She held the deed only a few moments before folding it away. A week later, she sold the property. Luke never asked why. The answer came on a bright morning in late April. A weathered wooden sign was lifted above a modest building near the edge of Red Bluff. Ellis House. The old stage stop had become something entirely different. Fresh bread cooled on open shelves. A kettle simmered on the stove. 3 narrow beds had been made upstairs beneath handmade quilts. Agnes Porter carried in blankets. Hannah Brooks stacked clean towels in a cupboard. Isaac Doyle unloaded flour from a wagon. Even Walter Briggs arrived with lumber balanced across his shoulder. "I figured you'll need another table." Ruby smiled. "I will." He set the boards inside the doorway. "I'll build it." Women traveling alone found a warm meal there. Children without family found a safe chair beside the fire. No one was asked where they had come from before being offered coffee and bread. One evening, Luke stood in the doorway watching Ruby laugh with a little girl who had spilled flour across the kitchen floor. The sound filled the room more completely than any music. He understood then that Ellis House had never been built from money. It had been built from every lonely mile Ruby had ever walked. The following spring, wildflowers covered the hills beneath the Bighorn Mountains. Neighbors gathered beneath a cottonwood tree overlooking Black Mesa Ranch. There were no fancy decorations, only rough wooden benches, fresh bread, coffee poured into tin cups. A fiddle played softly, while children chased one another through the grass. Ruby wore a simple cream-colored dress sewn by Hannah Brooks. Luke waited beneath the tree, his hat held in both hands. This time, there was no arrangement, no contract, no bargain. When Ruby reached him, he smiled. "The first time I asked you to come home, I offered you a key." She looked at him quietly. "Today, I'm asking for something different." He took a small ring from his pocket. Not expensive, just a plain gold band made by the blacksmith in Red Bluff. "I don't want a bride someone promised me. I want the woman who chose to stay." Ruby looked at the people gathered around them. Isaac, Agnes, Sheriff Burke, Emily Foster smiling beside Hannah. Then she looked back at Luke. "I thought I came here because I had nowhere else to go." She slipped the ring onto her finger. "But I stayed because I finally found somewhere I belonged." The fiddle began again. Someone cheered. Luke took her hand, and together they walked toward the ranch house beneath a sky washed clean by spring rain. Years later, Ellis House became known all along the Powder River Trail. Travelers remembered the warm bread. Widows remembered the kindness. Children remembered the woman who always kept an extra bowl of soup on the stove. One quiet evening, a young girl helping knead bread looked up at Ruby. "Do people ever stop remembering your past?" Ruby glanced through the open window. Luke was repairing the pasture fence, pausing now and then to wave toward the house. She smiled. "No." She brushed a little flour from the girl's sleeve. "They don't have to. What matters is that one day, you stop letting your past decide where your future ends." Outside, Luke looked up. Their eyes met across the yard. No promises needed to be spoken. The wind carried the smell of fresh-cut hay across Black Mesa Ranch. The gate stood open. The fire inside Ellis House was warm, and at last, Both of them were home. Maybe that's what home really is. Not the place where your story begins, but the place where someone finally sees you without asking you to hide the chapters that came before. If you had stood where Ruby once stood, carrying a single trunk, a worn Bible, and memories too heavy to speak aloud, would you have found the strength to trust again? And if you had been in Luke's boots, would you have looked beyond the rumors long enough to see the person quietly waiting behind them? The West was never gentle. It tested people with lonely miles, bitter winters, and hard choices. Yet the deepest wounds in this story were never left by snow or stone. They came from silence, from fear, and from believing that yesterday had the final word. What healed those wounds wasn't perfection. It was the courage to offer another chance, the humility to admit a mistake, and the quiet decision to stay when walking away would have been easier. If this story reminded you of someone you've loved, someone you've forgiven, or even a part of yourself still searching for peace, I'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may become the encouragement someone else needs today. And if these quiet journeys across the American frontier speak to your heart, I hope you'll join us again. There are more trails to follow, more forgotten lives to discover, and more stories where kindness, resilience, and love still find a way to light the darkest road.